This will make some Nintendo fans angry probably. This building behind me is the Nintendo headquarters in Kyoto. Why am I here? I seriously don't know. I don't even own a Nintendo. Imagine this for a second. You're a tiny indie developer. Maybe it is 2005. You spent months making a weird little game. It has pixel art, strange mechanics, and it has the perfect indie energy. Now you want to release it in a Nintendo console. Yeah, good luck. Because back then, publishing a game on a Nintendo system was almost impossible, unless you were a real studio with contracts, offices, and probably a suite somewhere in the building. Nintendo protects its stuff like it's made of actual gold, right? So how on earth did this company, the one famous for shutting down fan projects and sending lawyers after streamers, become one of the biggest platforms of indie game developers? Today, a solo developer can upload a game to the Nintendo Switch from a laptop and sell it next to the Nintendo big hits. Same company, completely different reality. So the big question is this: is Nintendo actually helping the indie game scene? Or are they just very good at smiling politely while doing whatever Nintendo wants anyway? And most importantly, who's helping who? Because the story behind this change is way more interesting than it looks. It involves Kyoto, Japanese doujin culture, and indie festival that appeared almost next door to Nintendo's headquarters, and a console that accidentally became one of the best indie platforms ever made. I have to be honest, portable consoles feel pretty indie. And yes, it gets a little weird along the way. To understand why this topic is interesting, we need to start with a place: Kyoto. Kyoto is Nintendo's home city. The original Nintendo headquarters is there. The newer offices are there. And recently, they even opened the Nintendo Museum there. When you walk around Kyoto, Nintendo does not feel like a loud tech company. It feels more like an old, quiet institution that has simply always existed. Which is funny, because something else very important to indie games also started in Kyoto: the Bit Summit. Bit Summit is one of the most important indie game festivals in Japan today. Developers show prototypes, publishers hunt for new games, and players discover strange experimental projects. And when you realize that Bit Summit started in the same city as Nintendo, you start wondering if that is really just a coincidence. But before we get there, we need to talk about something very important in Japanese creative culture: the word doujin. In the West, we say indie games. In Japan, for a long time, the closest concept was doujin. Doujin basically means self-published work. It is not limited to games. It can be anything created independently outside major companies. The culture is very old. One of the biggest examples is Comic-Con, short for Comic Market, a massive fan convention that started in 1975. Thousands of creators gather there to sell self-published work directly to fans. Games were part of that culture too. So, for decades, Japan already had something like an indie scene. It just used a different name and operated in a completely different ecosystem. And here is where the problem appears. Nintendo consoles were never designed for this world. If you were a doujin developer in the 90s or early 2000s, consoles were almost impossible to access. Nintendo did work with third-party developers, even in the 80s during the NES era. But the system required official approval, development kits, manufacturing agreements, and physical distribution through cartridges or discs. This worked perfectly for established studios. It did not work at all if you were two developers building a game after work. So doujin developers used other platforms. Most of them released games on PC. Sometimes they sold CDs directly at events like Comic-Con. Later they used early online distribution. It was messy, chaotic, and honestly very creative. Some famous indie-style Japanese games came out from this culture. One of the most famous examples is Touhou Project. I've already talked about this game in one of my previous videos. So, the talent was always there. The creativity was always there. But consoles, especially Nintendo consoles, were like a locked castle. Nintendo was not being evil here. They were just extremely traditional. Their business model was built around physical products, controlled distribution, and strong quality approval. That system made sense in the 80s and 90s, but it was a nightmare for tiny developers. Things started changing around 2008. Nintendo introduced two digital services, WiiWare and DSiWare. This was the first real moment where small digital games could appear on Nintendo platforms, without needing a physical cartridge. Suddenly, it sounded possible. A small team could theoretically release a downloadable game. But there was still a catch. Actually, several catches. You usually needed to register as a company. In many cases, you needed a physical office address. The approval process was slow and conservative. Development kits were not exactly cheap either. So while WiiWare and DSiWare opened the door slightly, it was still a very heavy door. Most of the games released there came from small or mid-sized studios, not true hobbyist developers. From today's perspective, it feels like a strange middle step, but at the time it was a big deal. And then something unexpected happened. Nintendo had a problem. Fast forward to 2013. The Wii U launched in 2012, and let's be honest, it did not exactly take over the world. Nintendo suddenly had gaps in their release schedule. Big gaps. Months where the platform did not have many new games. And this is where indie developers suddenly became very interesting. Nintendo of America introduced a branding term called Nindies. Yes, it literally meant Nintendo Indies. It was slightly goofy, but the idea was simple. Nintendo wanted to show that indie developers were welcome on their platform. But the really interesting part happened in Japan. Instead of immediately recruiting local indie developers, Nintendo started by publishing Western indie games in Japan. One famous example is Shovel Knight, created by the Yacht Club Games. Nintendo helped bring that game to the Japanese market, introducing local players to the modern concept of indie games. Why do this? Because in Japan, the word indie was not very common yet. Doujin culture existed, but the Western-style indie industry was still new. Nintendo basically helped translate the idea. But while this was happening, something very important appeared in Kyoto. We're in the Miyako Messe, where probably one of the biggest indie game festivals in Japan is held, the Bit Summit. In 2013, an event called Bit Summit launched in Kyoto. At first, it was relatively small, just a gathering of indie developers showing experimental projects. But it quickly became something much bigger. Bit Summit gave Japanese indie developers a physical place to meet publishers, platform holders, and international media. Suddenly, developers who previously sold games at conventions could show prototypes to global audience. So, Nintendo has been very present at Bit Summit, both as sponsor and as platform holder. They appeared as sponsors. They brought demo stations. They interacted directly with developers who would have been invisible to them 10 years earlier. This is one of those subtle turning points that people do not always notice. Nintendo slowly started standing in the same room with indie developers. In 2017, Nintendo launched the Nintendo Switch. And this is where the real shift happened. Alongside the console, Nintendo launched a dedicated developer portal. This portal allowed developers to register, request development tools, and publish games on the platform. The big change was accessibility. You did not need to be a large corporation anymore. You could be a small team. You could even be a solo developer. You could register online, download the tools, and start preparing your game for the Switch. For indie developers, this was huge. From a technical perspective, the Switch also turned out to be very indie-friendly. The hardware was powerful enough for modern engines like Unity and Unreal Engine, but not that complex that small teams could not optimize for it. Unity support in particular made development much easier for indie studios. Many developers simply exported their existing PC builds to Switch with additional optimization work. Of course, it was not completely automatic. Certification, performance testing, and controller support still required serious work. But compared to the early 2000s, the difference was night and day. And Nintendo did something else very clever. They started promoting indie games actively. In 2018, Nintendo of Japan launched a showcase series called Indie World. These were video presentations focused entirely on indie games coming to the Switch. They had trailers, developer interviews, and game announcements. This was important for two reasons. First one, it gave indie developers massive visibility. Appearing in an Indie World showcase could instantly bring attention from millions of Switch players. And second, it changed perception. Indie games were no longer hidden in a digital store menu. They were part of Nintendo's official messaging. Then, in 2019, something interesting happened. Nintendo unified their global indie branding under the name Indie World. Even in the West, the old Nindies branding slowly disappeared. Yeah, Nindies doesn't sound that great. For a company that historically controlled its brand extremely carefully, that decision says a lot about how important the indie ecosystem has become. So, is Nintendo actually the right place for indie games? The doors are genuinely open now, in a way they have never been before. The developer portal works. Indie World showcases happen regularly and get real attention. Nintendo has gone from being functionally not accessible to small developers to being one of the more indie-friendly platforms available. Well, kind of. That is real change, and it deserves credit. But open doors are not the same as guaranteed success. The Switch eShop has thousands of games on it, and discovering new titles on that storefront is honestly a mess. There is no good browse or recommendation system. Unless Nintendo personally features your game, or you do solid external marketing, you can get completely buried. So, if your plan is to publish on Switch and let the platform do the work, that plan needs serious reconsideration. And there is one more thing worth saying. Nintendo's support of indie games has always been partly strategic. Now, let's be honest for a second. Nintendo was desperate for content. That's why they opened to the indie world. They needed content for platforms that needed content. The Wii U pushed them toward indies. The Switch benefited from them. Whether that support holds as Nintendo's first-party lineup gets stronger is a real question. History suggests Nintendo prioritizes Nintendo above everything else. Always. Now, here's my question for you. Have you discovered any strange or amazing indie games on the Switch recently? And like always, thanks for watching!